The Victorian period is the only movement of poetry that we've covered in this series, at least, that takes its name from a monarch. Queen Victoria reigned from 1837 to her death in 1901, and her reign really covered a huge period, accelerated industrialization. We saw in the last lecture how that was just emerging at the end of the late 18th century. It's rapidly accelerated. We have the homogenization of manners and civility, this expansive growth of urban spaces, and of the global empire. This is the time of the empire. It's also a time of social reform and education acts. This is also the rise of the middle class. So we see a lot of education at this time coming into lower classes and a broadening of the middle class with trade. Viewing the literary type topography, if you were to come across the land of Victorian poetry from afar, a few major mountain ranges rise in the distance. You've got, namely, the peaks of the great novelists such as the Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens. You've got George Eliot, Willkie Collins. All of these rise to prominence out of the atmospheric haze, but we also see the outlines of essayists and short story writers such as Arthur Conan Doyle, Thomas Carlyle, whose star seems to have fallen lately, who was a great essayist and he wrote a novel, and Walter Pater in the later Victorian period. It's a period known predominantly in literature for its prose. But what about Victorian poetry? Poetry in the Victorian period is difficult to characterize because it's so prolific and it's so sprawlingly diverse. There are few defining characteristics by which the entire period may be described. So for this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to three major poets and place a poem of theirs each in conversation with some of the major cultural and literary interests shared by many other poets. So that way we get something representative of this time. Welcome all to our lecture on Victorian poetry. Last week we covered Romanticism, and next week we'll cover the Modernist period. Right between the two are the Victorians, and we're going to see in their poetry, you're going to recognize some romantic afterlives, sensibilities here, and we're also going to see some of the groundwork being laid for the Modernist movement, even in the early poetry of Tennyson. These lectures are sponsored by my Patreon supporters who are joining me over Zoom right now. Thanks to their contributions, I've been able to dedicate more time to my public humanities work and in publishing these lectures. So we'll meet after this lecture for perhaps some tea and to discuss some other poems from this period. So if you'd like to join the conversation and help make the study of poetry more accessible to those outside the university, you can find more information about my Patreon in the description below. So let's talk about Victorian medievalism and Tennyson. In Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1842 poems, 5 of 7 of those poems are medieval poems. So there are 7 medieval poems, and 5 of the 7 are Arthurian. So he's going back to the age of Arthur, this very national identity. And they owe a few details to the 15th century chronicler, prose writer Sir Thomas Malory in his Le Morte d'Arthur. We actually didn't cover that because that's prose in the Middle English lecture, but it's hugely important, hugely entertaining, by the way, too. You get a real sense of how Tennyson and other Victorians really just loved this book. Well, he wrote a poem, Tennyson, of that title, Morte d'Arthur. He also wrote an epic called Idylls of the King, which is a long epic poem, but this is a shorter one. The scene here in this poem depicts the death of King Arthur and his passing to the shores of Avalon. And I want to draw your attention to complexity of the medievalism of this time. We have a lot of poets who are looking to the past. Tennyson is one of them. And how in this poem we can see the negotiation of the modern global urban identity coming to terms with itself and with the past. Now, this is just a passage from the long poem. You'll want to go back and read the whole thing for yourself, but this is just extraordinary here. Let me just read the first section, pericope. Then saw they how there hove a dusky barge, dark as a funeral scarf from stem to stern, beneath them. And descending, they were ware that all the decks were dense with stately forms, black stoled, black hooded, like a dream. By these three queens with crowns of gold, and from them rose a cry that shivered to the tingling stars, and, as it were one voice, in agony of lamentation, like a wind that shrills all night in a wasteland where no one comes or hath come since the making of the world. Just going to circle this here, keyword wasteland, which is going to come up next lecture, as will this Arthurian myth. Notice how the lines sound with that muted echo. This is a scene of lament. The king is dying, the old order is passing away. This voiced alveolar of the D's, the stopped consonants of the T's. It's this muffled footsteps walking round, which is blending at a sense of, I think, anxiety. And then we have Arthur speaks. Then murmured Arthur, place me in the barge. And to the barge they came. There those three queens put forth their hands, and took the king, and wept. But she that rose, the tallest of them all, the fairest, laid his head upon her lap, and loosed the shattered casque, and chafed his hands, and called him by his name, complaining loud, and dropping bitter tears against his brow, striped with dark blood. For all his face was white and colorless, and like the withered moon smote by the fresh beam of the springing east. And all his greaves and cuisses dashed with drops of onset, and the light and lustrous curls that made his forehead like a rising sun high from the dais throne were parched with dust, or clotted to the points and hanging loose, mixed with the nightly growth that fringed his lips. So like a shattered column lay the king, not like that author who, with lance in rest, from spur to plume a star of tournament, shot through the lists at Camelot, and charged before the eyes of ladies and of kings. It's not surprising to find, I'm going to stop here and speak a little bit. It's not surprising to find, in the age of rapid industrialization, many poets turning a wistful eye to the medieval past. Medievalism generally refers to this revived interest in medieval thought, social values, literature, and architecture. You think of John Ruskin, in terms of architecture, his Seven Lamps of Architecture, all founded upon medieval principles of art. William Morris on the literary scene and the social values. Usually, it meant this idealized conception of the past. They wanted to take what was good about the past to preserve it. Medievalism, in this sense, is similar to a kind of romanticism. It's this reaction against classicism, in part, against urbanization, and in a resistance to the industrialized human. Formally, you'll notice that the poem is written in blank verse, a form redeemed by Coleridge and Wordsworth, as we saw last week in their conversation poems. Here, adapted by Tennyson, the use of narrative. The poem is so naturally rhythmic. Some portions are really good for chanting, and you could probably hear it in the way I was reciting these lines especially. For all his face was white and colorless, and like the withered moon smote by the fresh beam of the springing east. I mean, it's really, you can get into a kind of chant with these lines. Beautiful lines. Some poems you can really read that way. It's perfectly fine to do that. Now we come to the lament of Sir Bedivere, the lament of every sensitive person. And it was the lament of many Victorians. Then loudly cried the bold Sir Bedivere, "Ah, my Lord Arthur, whither shall I go? Where shall I hide my forehead and my eyes? For now I see the true old times are dead, when every morning brought a noble chance, and every chance brought out a noble night. Such times have not been since the light that led the holy elders with the gift of myrrh. But now the whole round table is dissolved, which was an image of the mighty world." It's a very medieval and Renaissance idea of microcosm. "And I, the last, go forth companionless. And the days darken round me, and the years, among new men, strange faces, other minds." The role of the poet in the Victorian period, again, stopping here real quick, uh, was difficult. They were withdrawn, many of them. Arnold, Tennyson, they were hesitant about addressing the social world. They really had this desire to pull back into the past, into nature, into their own mystique. Um, and I think we see that expressed beautifully here. There's so much sorrowful grandeur in these words of Sir Bedivere. He voices a song known too well to many, the soul's grieved perplexity, whither shall I go? Again, this echoing the words of uh, John 6, the Gospel of John, when Christ's apostles forsake him, or rather, many of his disciples do, and nothing but the 12 remain. And they say, "Whither shall we go?" It's the lament of John Milton's Adam and Eve, when they heard of their banishment from Eden. We just finished up those lectures with the Antrim Literature Project, and saw how this similar expression was there on the lips of Adam and Eve. It is the song of everyone who has lost the object and vessel of their faith. And this is what's happening to many Victorians. This is what's happening to Sir Bedivere. His is the song of many who lived in Tennyson's time, people who witnessed this massive, life-altering changes in time-honored beliefs and institutions. The old times have passed. The true old times are dead. The new industrial world has swept us all along the stream of progress and carried away our Arthurs with them. Then slowly answered Arthur from the barge. And here you get a real good sense of Tennyson's medievalism, which is, compared to other medievalisms, rather conservative. And slowly answered Arthur from the barge, "The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. Comfort thyself. What comfort is in me? I have lived my life, and that which I have done may he within himself make pure. But thou, if thou shouldst never see my face again, pray for my soul. More things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of. Wherefore, let thy voice rise like a fountain for me night and day. For what are men better than sheep or goats that nourish a blind life within the brain, if, knowing God, they lift not hands of prayer, both for themselves and those who call them friend? For so the whole round earth is every way bound by gold chains about the feet of God. But now, farewell. I am going a long way with these thou seest, if indeed I go. For all my mind is clouded with a doubt, to the island valley of Avalon, where falls not hail, or rain, or any snow, nor ever wind blows loudly, but it lies deep meadowed, Happy, fair with orchard lawns and bowery hollows, crowned with summer sea, where I will heal me of my grievous wound. Just beautiful lines. I used to read the Victorians when I was in high school. Before I'd go walking in the woods, I'd read for about at least an hour nonstop, and I guess I'd get it's kind of like a drunkenness or a hangover, because then when you'd go walking silently in the woods, you kind of still hear the rhythms beating in your head. And it happens if you can read poetry for 2 or 3 hours in a row sometimes, and you step away and go about your life, you can still almost hear what you're doing within the cadences of poetry. And this was one of those poems, Grievous Wound. Um, I'm reading this a bit allegorically, or at least in the context of this cultural shift. The grievous wound of modernity for Tennyson is really only to be healed in the other world. And the only action is a kind of faith that hovers between this heroic hope and stoic resignation. And we see the two kind of held in balance in complex ways in Arthur's last words, his sermon to Sir Bedivere. But this is just one example of Tennyson's conservative medievalism. But this Victorian medievalism comes in all forms. My favorite, I think, is William Morris's socialist medievalism. Just his visions are scintillating. You can almost just get carried away in believing that such a world could be as easily as Morris thought. I went through a phase in college where I was just obsessed with Morris's poetry and his prose. His prose is good. Of his poetry, he has many short lyrics. He has a long poem, an epic called The Earthly Paradise. He absolutely soars in that poem sometimes. And then his novel, News from Nowhere, is an example of his prose style, a futuristic novel. I see Julia shaking her head in recognition, about London in I believe it's the 1960s, or in the 20th century. And River Thames is crystal clear, and everyone is just happy. Everyone's working, and they enjoy work. It's a utopia novel, really. So there are different kinds of this medievalism. Now I want to shift from a cultural exploration to a more literary one, that of voice. Ezra Pound believed that Robert Browning's complex use of the dramatic voice was one of the best things to come out of this poetry of the Victorian period. Let me read aloud for you Browning's My Last Duchess. Short poem, often anthologized, 56 lines. It's what's called a dramatic monologue, spoken by a narrator who is both, in this case, intriguing and horrifying. It's an enduring murder mystery, really, and a psychological sketch. Now, a dramatic monologue is a poem that is in the form of a speech of an individual character, usually to be set on stage, in this case. More of a closet drama, just an excerpt we have. And in the poem, an imagined speaker addresses a silent listener, usually not the reader. So before I read this, I want to talk about another modernist, T.S. Eliot, in his 1953 essay, Three Voices of Poetry. T.S. Eliot outlines three kinds of poetic voice. The first voice, he says, is the voice of the poet talking to himself or nobody. Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey begins in this mode and then addresses Dorothy at the end, his sister. The second voice is the poet addressing an audience, large or small. We see Whitman doing this in Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself, who'll often address the reader. And sometimes the reader becomes the audience for Whitman. But the third kind of voice, Eliot says, is when the poet creates this dramatic character, imagined character, speaking in verse, when he is saying not what the poet, would say in his own person, but only what the poet can say through the limits of an imaginary character addressing another imaginary character. A little bit of context for this poem. This poem tells us a lot about the speaker, the Duke of Ferrara. It's in the form of this monologue. And the Duke of Ferrara is speaking to a messenger from the court of Tyrol, whose daughter the Duke seeks as a second wife. as his second wife. Um, his first wife is mysteriously gone. We don't know what happened to her. We get clues in this poem. The Duke's nature is revealed incrementally through his comments about his first wife and the way he's showing the messenger her picture. And this is just a great example of Browning's subtle use of voice. We learn not only about the speaker, the Duke of Ferrara's arrogance and cruelty, but also we learn about his first wife. And we even get a sense of this growing nervousness in the messenger, who is silent the whole time, sort of the captive audience. So let me just read it aloud for you, and then we'll look at it on the page. Duke of Ferrara. That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall. Let's see. I think I hear a cell phone going. Nope, that wasn't mine. Okay. Let's start over. At the beginning. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will't please you, sit and look at her. I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers' glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. And seemed as if they would ask, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess' cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-blush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast, the drooping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherry some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all in each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked him in good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift, who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there you exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, or plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, e'en then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will't please you rise? We'll meet the company below, then. I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which claws of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. This poem first appeared in 1842 in Browning's dramatic lines. The poem, I don't know if you heard this, it's so natural of a poem. It's written in iambic pentameter, but in rhyming couplets, so conversational that you can hear it answering, the rhymes answering one another. It's interesting, the title of this poem actually, when it was first published, was just simply called Italy. That's where it takes place. Notice the lines here in this first. The length of the sentences. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder. Now Fra, or Friar Pandolf's hands, who's the painter, worked busily, day and night. And then he asked the messenger, will please you sit and look at her? I said Fra Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you, that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. We don't know what happened to the first wife. Perhaps murder. That seems to be the guess. But we see this control on the part of the Duke, even now, to control her. None puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. He's controlling access to her. Otherwise, she's kept, her painting is just kept behind a curtain. And they would ask, how came that glance, that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek, talking about the blush of happiness, of joy. But notice, too, how the enjambment here suspends that word spot. You might think of Macbeth, as I think Browning has in mind here, out by a spot, this spot of stain, which we think is something perhaps sinful, but really we're corrected upon this suspicion within this word, by of joy into the Duchess's cheek. And we've heard him complain. What's his complaint against her? That such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart too soon made glad. She's indiscriminate in her joy. The Duke of Ferrara wants himself, or rather his 900 years old name, to be the only thing his first wife cherished. And she didn't. She loved everything, from the sunset to a spray of cherries to the white mule. And he wants, it's this obsessive narcissism that he's really, Browning, I think, portraying into this character. And of course, we don't hear the Duke. It's almost like listening to one side of a conversation. We get a sense of his pride here. His 900 years old name. And as though he's speaking, he is speaking to the messenger, but perhaps the messenger has asked, or he reads in his looks some skepticism. Who would stoop to blame this sort of trifling? This is the sort of thing that he would never correct his first wife on. You can't just reason and say, look, I don't like the way that you indiscriminately love everything. I'm so jealous that I would have you only love me. Because such communication is a form of condescension, a stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? And there we have the key moment here in the poem. This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. End stop. There she stands as if alive. This use of the elusive narration and the complexity of voice here is what is prized, I think, in Browning. His understatement, even, in some of his other poems. He was asked by readers, one of the readers reported, he asked Browning, so did the Duke of Ferrara kill his first wife? And Browning said, probably. And then he stopped and he added, or she might have been sent to a monastery. But he wasn't going to let on because he didn't know himself. This is an imagined character that's sort of psychology being explored here. Whose psychology is being explored? Well, please you rise. We'll meet the company below, then. Be disallowed, though his fair daughter self, as I vowed my stating object. And we see this nervousness in the messenger, perhaps. as he's rushing to leave. He says, "Nay, we'll go together down, sir." Now, if I were Browning, and if I had the lyrical genius of Browning, uh, I would have ended the poem here. What else is there to say? Is there anything else to say? But no, he adds 2.5 lines. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse. As they're going down, he points to another object of art. Why Neptune taming the seahorse? Thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. It's my suspicion that Neptune is somewhat of a portrait of the Duke of Ferrara taming something of the sea. Women usually associated with the sea, sort of rhythms, cycles, even chaos in sort of this archetypal way, which is totally, unfair, but it's part of, these structures of symbols, and Neptune being very domineering. We see a picture of what's going to happen again in The Second Wife, if he is married again. I think that's what those last 2.5 lines are doing, but I'd love to hear what you all think about that as well. Again, wanted to point your attention to Browning. He has a lot of poems that make use of this voice. It's a great example of how the speaker's voice can reveal a lot about their character. By paying attention to the Duke's words, how he chooses to portray himself and his wife, and his past wife, his first wife, we can learn about his arrogance, his possessiveness, ultimately his capacity for violence. Fred, did you want to add something? I saw the hand up, or was that an accident? No, all good? No worries. I think for the last bit of this lecture, I want to turn to the idea of religion at this time. And I want to turn to Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. The Victorian period is often regarded as a time of secularization, as the long withdrawing roar of faith, as that gives way to the voice of the scientist, of the philosopher. This was the time when scientific discoveries had challenged long-held beliefs about the nature of humankind, our place among the animals and in the cosmos, the age of the earth itself. So this is often considered secularization is happening now, when people are displacing theological concepts into the realm of art. I think that happens to an extent, but I, along with other readers and some scholars of this period, do not consider this necessarily as secularization defined as such. But we see a renegotiation of beliefs in the Victorian era, which were actually on the rise, spiritual beliefs. I think a much clearer picture is that faith did not necessarily retreat into art. It was merely transformed. It moved outside of orthodoxy for sure, but it garnered a lot of attention to orthodoxy. You think of the Oxford movement and some of the rising evangelical movements at the time. But you even think of the atheists and agnostics, such as William Hale White, who finds a kind of religious devotion in the poetry of William Wordsworth. There's a slim monograph by a scholar whose last name is Ryan, Robert Ryan. It's a book called Charles Darwin and the Church of William Wordsworth. It's really great. If you have access to an institutional library and you can find that, it's a great read about this period and about how, in some ways, Wordsworth's poetry became an alternative to institutional religion. Just fascinating, super erudite study. So while we can't say that the Victorians became less spiritual, we can say that their religiosity differed significantly from other previous eras. Now I want to turn to Arnold's Dover Beach. Matthew Arnold. It's a beautiful poem. Matthew Arnold is often regarded as the most representative of the Victorian man. If there is such a thing, it's Matthew Arnold. Dover Beach is just a beautiful example of this. And I think I've read portions of this before in my lectures on close reading poetry. But if you've read the romantic lyric, I have a series of lectures called The Greater Romantic Lyric, in which there are 4 poems I analyze. And I'm using M.H. Abrams' structure that he recognized within the greater romantic lyric, Wordsworth, Coleridge, to some extent Keats, and to some extent Shelley. And I read those four poems in context with that. The greater romantic lyric, Abrams says, begins with an outward address to the landscape, or a reflection or meditation upon the landscape itself, a journey inward as the second movement, and then concludes in the third movement of returning to the landscape with spiritual insight. We see that movement here in this poem. See if you can pick up on it. It's a brief poem, beautifully lyric, and I'll read it. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand. Begin and cease, and then again begin with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. It's almost a parody of not the German romantic lyric, the greater romantic lyric. Instead of turning inward to return to the landscape with this new, cheerful faith, spiritual vision, call for prophecy in the case of Schelling, or the longing of a sweet death by Keats, you have this cynicism, which is so Victorian and so modernist. You can see how Matthew Arnold, as the representative Victorian, is really bridging two worlds here. We see the modernist. Hated to botch these lines, the most beautifully lyric of all in this poem, with its interplay, with its assonance of short and long vowels, begin and cease, and then again begin. Quickens here with these monosyllabic short syllables, long syllable, short syllable, and then slows us with the tremulous cadence, slow. Notice the sibilants there drawing out, representing or mimicking the eternal note of sadness. The waves drawing back and flinging on the sand. And here's the key moment which we read. The sea of faith was once too at the full. He's looking back, perhaps to the medieval period as well, but not so much wistfully, as though the medieval period holds the answer, but simply as a time perhaps naive, unimpeded by doubt in the world. And here's the only consolation: ah, love, let us be true to one another. In this Spencerian demonic landscape, this wasteland, we might call it, this darkling plain. Spencerian, that word plain, first stanza of Canto 1, Book 1, the night pricking on the plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle. But this is not the red night struggle of valor and of truth. This is one where ignorant armies clash by night. For Arnold, well, for the poet, rather, poet's voice in this poem, romantic love, infidelity replaces the sort of religious certainty of the past, which is now declining. I mentioned in the video on the canon that Matthew Arnold's substitute for religion, rather his role, that he's the role of religion in society, culture promoting, national identity promoting force, is shifted to poetry or literature more broadly, great literature. In fact, this was during the time when English literature was developing as an academic discipline. The first English professor at Harvard, Francis James Child, who actually was a ballad collector, the Child Ballads, named after him. Our departmental library is named after Child. This was around that time, the late 19th century. And it was also when figures like Matthew Arnold were repairing to the study of English literature as a replacement for religion. I'm not sure if he would really see it that way, but I think he would. Some of his essays reveal that he's cognizant of what he's doing. In fact, to this day, I think it's fair to say that the Academy of English Literature, at least in America, functions very similarly to American religion, at least to my eye. And it's not a coincidence that many disaffected religious people have found respite in literary study, which, by the way, fundamentally evolved from the theological practice of biblical exegesis. You had close readers really within the theological school before it became a way of reading poetry. So it's interesting. We see the rise of the English department here, a return to English poetry as something that is redemptive. We see the influence of Romanticism on Victorian poetry with this focus on nature, emotion, the individual. We see the rise of the Gothic that we saw in the Romantic poetry actually being carried further into darker themes of murder and psychological complexity. We see, too, in much of its poetry, which I did not mention much of, the role of empire and colonialism in shaping Victorian poetry. Rudyard Kipling has great literature on that, so that's something to be aware of when you're reading poetry from this period on your own. And of course, the impact of scientific discoveries on the Victorian imagination is something to want to keep in mind. Other poets you might want to explore: Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who married Robert Browning. She's an excellent poet. Christina Rossetti. We'll have a lecture on her in 2 weeks and her poetry for the May devotional course. And Gerard Manley Hopkins, who didn't get mentioned here, but I'll also cover him in the last week of May for the devotional poetry course as well. So next week, we will meet again to discuss modernism. For everyone on YouTube, thanks for watching, and until next time.